What if the most perfect celebrity family image you've believed for 20 years was only half the story? What if the fairy-tale wedding, the designer smiles, the private jets, and those flawless Instagram posts were hiding attention so deep, it finally exploded from inside the family itself? Because Brooklyn Beckham just did something nobody expected.
He didn't post a cute family photo. He didn't drop a brand collab. He didn't stay silent like everyone thought he would. He spoke.
And what he hinted at has people questioning everything they thought they knew about the Beckham dynasty and his billionaire wife's role in the middle of it all. Was this really just wedding drama? Or is this a much bigger story about control, image, identity, and a son trying to step out of a global brand that carries his own last name? Why did a dream marriage turn into a silent standoff with one of the most powerful celebrity families on the planet? And why are fans now split into two camps, each believing a completely different version of the same story?
This isn't gossip anymore. This is a family narrative cracking in public.
And the internet can't look away that you'd think a wedding that cost millions, hosted at a billionaire's oceanfront estate, attended by A-list celebrities, and photographed like a royal ceremony would be remembered as a perfect beginning. But for Brooklyn Beckham, that night allegedly became the moment everything changed.
Not publicly, not instantly, but internally.
Because according to what he later hinted at, the tension didn't start after the wedding.
It started inside it. The smiles were there.
The cameras were flashing. Guests were sipping champagne under chandeliers. But behind the polished choreography of luxury and tradition, something felt off. Something that most people in the room sensed, but nobody dared to say out loud. And it all circled back to one unexpected detail: the dress. Victoria Beckham, a global fashion icon, had reportedly offered to design Nicola's wedding gown.
It sounded like the perfect symbolic gesture.
Future mother-in-law designing the bride's dress?
That's headline gold.
That's the kind of story magazines dream of printing. But then, plans changed.
Nicola walked down the aisle in Valentino.
No public explanation.
No dramatic statement.
Just a quiet switch that set off loud whispers behind the scenes. Fans didn't think much of it at the time. But later, when Brooklyn began referencing moments that shifted the energy of the wedding, people started connecting dots that once seemed harmless. Because this wasn't just about fashion. It was about expectations, emotions, and the delicate balance between two powerful families used to doing things their own way. And then came the moment that guests still reportedly talk about in hushed tones: the dance. This was meant to be Brooklyn and Nicola's first dance as husband and wife.
Their cinematic moment.
The emotional highlight of the night. Music filled the room. Eyes turned to the couple. But before Nicola could step forward, the microphone was taken, and an unexpected announcement redirected the attention in a way nobody predicted. What happened next has been described in different ways by different people, but one thing remains consistent: the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Instead of a romantic spotlight on the newlyweds, attention shifted. Confusion spread across faces. Guests looked at each other, unsure whether to smile, clap, or simply stay still. Brooklyn would later describe this as the most uncomfortable moment of the entire wedding. A moment that didn't feel celebratory, but strangely symbolic. Symbolic of what, exactly? That's where interpretations begin. Because to some, it was just an awkward mix-up. To others, it represented something deeper. A reminder that even on his own wedding day, Brooklyn was still standing in the shadow of a name much bigger than himself. And that feeling didn't leave him after the music stopped.
It followed him. Into the marriage. Into the headlines.
Into the silence that came after. What many people didn't realize is that after the wedding buzz faded, Brooklyn and Nicola became noticeably distant from the Beckham family in public appearances.
Fewer photos. Fewer joint events.
Fewer cheerful captions. At first, fans brushed it off as normal newlywed privacy.
But then the rumors started gaining rhythm.
People noticed that Brooklyn began subtly adjusting how he presented himself.
Not loudly. Not dramatically.
Just small changes that, over time, felt meaningful. He started emphasizing Peltz Beckham. He leaned harder into projects that had nothing to do with fashion, football, or legacy.
Cooking shows. Food ventures.
Lifestyle branding that felt intentionally separate from the Beckham blueprint. And that's when people started asking a new question: is Brooklyn trying to build a life, or escape one? Because for someone raised inside one of the most media-managed families in the world, stepping out of that structure isn't simple.
It's not just emotional. It's strategic. It's psychological.
Every move becomes a statement. Every absence becomes louder than any interview. And then came the claims that really stirred the pot. The idea that Brooklyn felt his choices, his career paths, even his personal identity, were always viewed through the lens of how they affected the Beckham image.
To outsiders, it sounded dramatic.
To others, it sounded painfully believable. Imagine growing up where every hobby becomes a headline. Every experiment becomes a meme. Every mistake becomes international news. Where even trying to figure out who you are gets judged against parents who are global icons. That kind of pressure doesn't scream.
It whispers. It builds slowly.
And sometimes, it takes a life event as big as a wedding to bring all of it to the surface. Brooklyn's narrative, as people interpret it, isn't about hatred. It's about suffocation. Not rebellion, but relief. Relief in finding a partner whose family operates differently, more private, less brand-driven, more personal than performative. And that contrast, his implied, changed everything for him. Because once you experience a different version of family life, it becomes hard to go back to the old one without noticing the difference. That's where Nicola's role becomes central in the public conversation.
Not as a villain. Not as a mastermind.
But as the person who showed Brooklyn an alternative rhythm of living. One where moments don't need to be camera-ready. One where presence matters more than presentation. And suddenly, what looked like wedding drama starts feeling like the beginning of a much deeper shift in identity. Meanwhile, the Beckham camp stayed silent. No interviews. No clarifications. No emotional posts. And that silence? It only made the internet louder. Because when one side speaks in hints and the other side says nothing, people start filling the gaps with theories.
Was this a private disagreement blown out of proportion?
Or was this the quiet unraveling of a family dynamic that had been tightly controlled for decades?
Brooklyn didn't shout. He didn't accuse directly.
But what he suggested was enough to make people look back at years of perfectly curated family moments and wonder what they might have missed. And just like that, a fairy tale wedding stopped being a love story in the public eye. It became the origin story of a family rift that nobody saw coming, but now can't stop watching. Mija, continuing the same tone, suspense, and flow. No new allegations, no invented facts. Just dramatic, viral-style commentary built on public narratives and interpretations. What really turned whispers into wildfire wasn't a single interview or a loud social media rant.
It was the pattern.
Because after the wedding, the distance didn't look accidental anymore. It looked intentional. Brooklyn and Nicola weren't showing up to the same family events. Birthday posts felt formal. Public interactions felt edited. And for a family once known for constant unity, that shift didn't go unnoticed. Fans started doing what the internet does best: investigating captions, reading between lines, comparing timelines, analyzing who liked whose post and who didn't. And the more people looked, the more questions surfaced. Why did Brooklyn seem calmer, almost lighter, in photos with Nicola's family? Why did he look more relaxed in kitchens than on red carpets? Why did he stop leaning into the Beckham spotlight and start building something that looked deliberately low profile? That's when the narrative shifted from family tension to something more psychological. Because Brooklyn began hinting that what people saw as privilege growing up didn't always feel like freedom to him.
He described a life where every decision carried weight beyond personal happiness.
Where choices weren't just about passion, but perception. Where trying something new wasn't encouraged as exploration, but measured as a potential headline. Photography,
modeling, acting, cooking.
To the public, it looked like a young man jumping from one interest to another. Critics called him confused,
privileged,
a Nepo baby who couldn't find his lane. But through his perspective, it sounded different. It sounded like someone trying to find an identity outside a shadow so large, it covered everything. And that's where the conversation got uncomfortable for fans. Because it forced people to ask a question nobody ever asked before. What if being a Beckham wasn't always as glamorous as it looked? Brooklyn hinted that love in the household sometimes felt tied to appearances. That showing up, smiling for cameras, maintaining the perfect image wasn't optional. It was expected.
Miss an event? That's noticed. Skip a photo? That's discussed. Step away from the spotlight? That's questioned.
Again, these weren't direct accusations. They were impressions,
feelings,
personal experiences shared in a way that left room for interpretation. But interpretation is exactly what the internet thrives on. And then came the detail that made people pause. The claim that before the wedding, there were discussions about his name and branding rights. To most viewers, that sounded confusing at first.
But then it clicked. The Beckham name isn't just a surname. It's a global commercial asset.
A brand built over decades with discipline, management, and careful image control. If Brooklyn felt that even his own name was part of that machinery, it would explain why adding pelts publicly wasn't just romantic.
It was symbolic.
A quiet declaration that he wanted ownership of who he was becoming. That's when people stopped looking at this like gossip and started seeing it as a struggle over identity. And Nicola's presence in all of this?
It suddenly made more sense. Because by Brooklyn's tone, she wasn't pulling him away. She was the first person who didn't treat him like a brand extension. She treated him like Brooklyn, not Beckham. That difference, he implied, was life-changing. Sources close to them reportedly described their post-wedding life as peaceful. Private dinners, cooking at home, fewer public appearances, more normalcy than glamour. And for someone raised under constant cameras, normal can feel revolutionary. Meanwhile, the Beckham silence continued. David occasionally spoke in general terms about parenting, about giving children space to make mistakes. Victoria remained completely quiet. And that silence created two very different reactions online. Some people saw it as maturity, dignity, refusing to turn family pain into a media circus. Others saw it as distance, emotional coldness, a refusal to address what Brooklyn was hinting at. Both interpretations spread like wildfire. Then another moment resurfaced that added emotional weight to the story, the wildfire animal rescue claim. Brooklyn suggested that during a devastating moment in Los Angeles, Nicola reached out hoping for support in helping displaced animals. And the response, according to his version, was not what they expected. This detail hit people differently. Because it wasn't about ego, fashion, or weddings. It was about compassion, empathy, humanity. Whether there's more to that story or not, for Brooklyn, it became symbolic. A small moment that represented a larger emotional distance. And once again, fans were split. Some believed this showed how far things had drifted. Others believed there had to be more context missing. But the pattern remained. Brooklyn felt unheard, unseen, and emotionally separate long before the public noticed anything. That's why when he finally spoke, it didn't feel impulsive. It felt like a build-up. Years of staying quiet. Years of trying to keep things private. Until he felt the narrative was being shaped without his voice. And that's when he decided to add his. Not through shouting, but through carefully worded statements, symbolic actions, and visible life changes. He blocked his parents on social media. Communication reportedly went through formal channels. Public sightings with the Beckham family became rare. This wasn't a loud breakup. It was a quiet exit. And sometimes, quiet exits say more than loud fights. People began revisiting old interviews, old documentaries, old family photos, asking themselves if they had missed signs of pressure hiding behind the polish. Because if what Brooklyn felt is true for him, it changes how people see the Beckham story entirely. Not as villains, not as heroes, but as a family that mastered image so well that nobody ever asked what it felt like to grow up inside it. And the more this perspective spread, the more the story stopped being about a wedding. It became about what happens when a child raised inside a global brand decides he wants to be a person first, and a Beckham second. By now, this wasn't being discussed like celebrity gossip anymore. It started sounding like a case study. A case study of what happens when a family becomes so iconic, so polished, so carefully presented to the world, that the line between real life and public image slowly starts to blur. Because the more people listened to Brooklyn's perspective, the more they realized this wasn't about one bad wedding moment, or one awkward dance, or even one disagreement. It was about years of pressure quietly stacking up behind a flawless facade. For decades, the Beckhams represented unity, discipline, perfection, a family that never looked messy in public, never emotional, never out of sync. Every red carpet appearance felt choreographed. Every interview controlled. Every family photo looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. And that image worked. It turned them into one of the most respected celebrity families in the world. A global blueprint for how fame, fashion, sports, and family could exist in harmony. But now, people were asking a question nobody dared to ask before. What does it cost to maintain an image like that for 25 years? Because if Brooklyn's feelings are genuine, then maybe the cost wasn't financial. Maybe it was personal. He described growing up feeling like mistakes weren't allowed to be private. That every failure, every career experiment, every misstep became public conversation. Most people get to figure themselves out quietly in their 20s. Brooklyn had to do it under a global microscope. And when critics labeled him confused, inconsistent,
or privileged, he didn't push back publicly. But internally, it seems, it weighed on him. The Nepo baby label followed him everywhere. To the world, he had everything handed to him. To him, it felt like he never got to earn anything without his last name being part of the conversation. And that's where Nicola's family environment reportedly felt like a relief.
Less public, less performative, less concerned with how things look from the outside.
Brooklyn has suggested that being around that dynamic showed him a version of family life that felt calmer,
more personal, less strategic.
And once he experienced that, returning to the old rhythm felt impossible. That's why this situation doesn't feel like a rebellious phase.
It feels like a reset.
A young man trying to redefine who he is without the weight of a global legacy attached to every decision. Meanwhile, the Beckham side remains composed, silent, dignified. David occasionally speaks in broad, reflective terms about parenting and allowing children space to grow. Victoria says nothing publicly at all. And that silence is interpreted in two completely different ways depending on who you ask.
Some see it as heartbreak too deep for words.
Others see it as emotional distance that Brooklyn had been hinting at for years.
There's no screaming, no public back and forth, no messy interviews, just space. And sometimes, space feels louder than conflict. Fans began noticing that Brooklyn and Nicola appeared genuinely at peace. Casual walks, cooking together,
fewer glamorous events,
more normal life.
He leaned harder into food content, his hot sauce brand, lifestyle projects that felt intentionally detached from football fields, fashion weeks, and luxury campaigns. It didn't look like someone running away.
It looked like someone breathing for the first time. That's why this story hits differently. Because there is no clear villain. No dramatic betrayal.
Just two completely different understandings of what family, success, and support should look like. Brooklyn seems to believe family should feel emotionally safe, private, and unconditional. The Beckhams built a family that operates like a world-class brand, structured, disciplined, image-aware, and globally admired.
Neither approach is wrong.
But when those two worlds collide inside one household, friction becomes inevitable.
And the public is watching it unfold in real time.
What makes this even heavier is Brooklyn's line about not wanting reconciliation right now.
That didn't sound emotional. It sounded final. Not angry, just tired.
As if years of trying to explain how he felt had gone unheard, and stepping away was the only option left.
For parents, hearing something like that is devastating. For children, saying something like that is equally painful.
And that's the part people forget in all the headlines. This is still a family.
A father, a mother, a son.
Not characters in a show. Real people dealing with very real emotions, just under very unreal levels of public attention.
Now, every Beckham family post gets dissected. Every caption analyzed.
Every song choice turned into a theory.
And Brooklyn? He's doing the opposite. Less talking. Less posting, more living. Which might be the loudest message of all.
Because in a world where celebrities rush to control narratives, his decision to step back from the spotlight feels deliberate.
He's not trying to win public opinion. He's trying to protect his peace.
And maybe that's what this entire story was building toward.
Not revenge. Not exposure. Not scandal. But distance. Distance from pressure. From expectations. From an image that never fully felt like his. The once untouchable Beckham image now looks human. Vulnerable. Imperfect. Not because of accusations, but because of perspective. A perspective that says even the most glamorous families can struggle when personal identity and public image don't align. So now the world waits. Will time soften this divide?
Will private conversations happen away from cameras? Will this be remembered as a phase or permanent shift? Nobody knows. But one thing is certain. This story changed how people see the Beckhams forever.
Not as a flawless dynasty,
but as a family navigating pain in public, just like anyone else, only with millions watching. And now the question isn't just what happened. The real question is, who do you believe? Do you see a son finally breaking free from the pressure of a global legacy? Or do you see parents who spent decades building a name, only to watch it get questioned in public by their own child?
Because this story isn't black and white.
It's emotional.
It's layered. And it's still unfolding right in front of us. One wedding. One family.
Two completely different versions of the same reality. And somewhere in the middle of all the headlines, captions, silence, and symbolism, is a truth only they truly know.
That's why the internet can't stop talking about this.
That's why every post, every sighting, Every quiet move feels like a clue, and that's why this story feels bigger than celebrity gossip.
It feels human, messy, real. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Brooklyn is protecting his peace?
Or do you think the Beckham silence says more than words ever could?
Was this really about a wedding, or something that's been building for years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it.
And if you want more deep dives into the stories celebrities don't openly explain but the world can't stop analyzing, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because sometimes, the loudest drama happens in total silence.